This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, business, events and incidents are the products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.
Roger had spent nearly half his life driving the same late-night route, a long, winding stretch of road, threading through the quieter outskirts of the city, where streetlights stood far apart and houses grew sparse with each passing kilometer. At 46, his routine had hardened into something almost mechanical, his body conditioned to the rhythm of the engine's hum, the squeal of brakes, and the occasional flicker of dim fluorescent lights inside the bus. He was known among his coworkers as dependable, the kind of man who rarely called in sick and never complained about being assigned the last trip of the night, a shift most drivers avoided for reasons they rarely explained in full. The route itself was uneventful, especially after midnight, when passengers became few and far between. By the time Roger reached the final half of the journey, the bus was often empty, leaving him alone with the dull vibrations of the vehicle and the distant hum of insects beyond the windows. It was a solitude he had grown accustomed to, even welcomed, as it allowed his thoughts to drift freely without interruption. Some nights, he replayed fragments of his past, lingering on decisions he wished he could revisit. Other nights, he drove in silence, his mind as empty as the road ahead. The first time he noticed the passenger, it was just after 1:20 in the morning, at a stop he had passed countless times without incident. The place was little more than a weathered metal bench and a flickering lamppost casting a weak yellow glow over the cracked pavement. It stood near an old residential area that had long since thinned out, with only a few houses still occupied, and most others left to decay behind rusted gates. Roger slowed the bus as he approached, more out of habit than expectation, and that was when he saw the figure standing beneath the lamp. The passenger was motionless, positioned just within the circle of dim light, their features obscured by shadow. It was unusual to see anyone waiting at that hour, but not impossible, and Roger thought little of it at first. He brought the bus to a stop and opened the doors with a soft hiss, expecting the usual routine to follow. The passenger boarded without a word. There was something about the way they moved that struck Roger as peculiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Their steps were steady, but lacked the subtle shifts of weight that usually accompanied movement, as if each foot was placed with deliberate precision rather than natural balance. They wore dark clothing that seemed damp, clinging slightly to their frame, and their head remained angled downward in a way that concealed their face. Roger gave a brief nod, the silent acknowledgement he offered to most late-night passengers, but received nothing in return. The figure simply moved past him, their presence marked only by a faint, cold draft that lingered in the air for a moment longer than it should have. Through the rearview mirror, Roger watched as the passenger took a seat near the back of the bus, choosing a spot by the window. It was a habit many late-night riders shared, preferring distance and anonymity over proximity to the driver. There was nothing overtly alarming about it, yet something unsettled him in a way he struggled to define. He told himself it was nothing more than the hour, the fatigue creeping into his senses and making ordinary things feel unfamiliar. With a quiet exhale, he closed the doors and continued along the route. For several minutes, the ride continued in silence. Roger kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at the mirrors as he always did, checking for movement, for reassurance that everything behind him remained as it should. Each time he looked, he saw the passenger seated in the same position, head slightly bowed, hands resting on their lap. They did not shift, did not fidget, did not exhibit the small, unconscious movements that marked a living presence. As the bus rolled through the darker stretches of the route, the streetlights outside became less frequent, leaving long intervals of shadow where visibility dropped significantly. The interior lights flickered once, briefly dimming before returning to their usual weak glow. Roger felt a tightening in his chest, an unease that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He adjusted the mirror slightly, angling it to get a clearer view of the passenger. For a moment, there was nothing. The seat where the figure had been sitting appeared empty. The fabric undisturbed, the space devoid of any sign that someone had occupied it at all. Roger's grip on the steering wheel tightened instinctively, his pulse quickening as he blinked and leaned forward, trying to correct his angle. When he looked again, the passenger was there, seated in the same position, head bowed, unmoving. A cold sensation spread along Roger's spine, creeping upward in a slow, deliberate crawl. He forced himself to look away, focusing instead on the road ahead. But the image lingered in his mind, repeating itself with unnatural clarity. There had been a moment, however brief, when the seat had been empty, and he could not convince himself otherwise. The remainder of the route passed without further incident, but the silence within the bus took on a different quality, one that pressed against Roger's senses with increasing intensity. He found himself listening for sounds that never came. The shifting of fabric, the faint rustle of movement, the subtle indications that another person shared the space with him. Yet there was nothing. When the bus reached its final stop, Roger pulled over and opened the doors, expecting the passenger to disembark as all others did. No one moved. He waited longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the mirror, watching the still figure at the back. The seconds stretched uncomfortably, each one amplifying the tension that had settled deep within him. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, Roger stood from his seat. The act felt heavier than it should, as though the air itself resisted his movement. He stepped into the aisle, his gaze locked on the passenger as he began to walk toward the back of the bus. Each footstep echoed faintly, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. When he reached the row where the passenger sat, he stopped. The seat was empty. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no indentation in the cushion, no lingering presence to suggest the figure had existed at all. Roger stood frozen for several moments, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had seen with what now lay before him. That was the first night. The second night, the passenger returned. And by the third, Roger realized something far worse than he had initially feared. The passenger never appeared in the mirror when he looked directly at it. By the fourth night, Roger's unease had hardened into something he could no longer dismiss as fatigue or imagination. The passenger waited at the same lamp-lit bench along the cracked pavement, the glow of the streetlight barely illuminating the figure, whose features remained obscured beneath a low-shadowed hood. The bus rolled to a stop, the doors sighing open with the familiar hiss. The passenger entered silently, their movements measured and deliberate, leaving a faint, damp chill in the air as they passed. Roger's eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror as they had every night. The reflection should have been confirmation, reassurance that the figure sat quietly in the back. But he noticed something new, something that made his stomach knot with dread. The passenger's reflection was absent. No dark figure in the rearview, no movement of fabric, no shadow shifting with the dim interior lights. The passenger was there, yet entirely invisible in the mirror. His mind resisted the realization, attempting rational explanations, lighting angles, reflections failing. But the instinctive chill crawling along his spine insisted otherwise. The route stretched ahead, long and empty, and Roger's eyes remained fixed on the road. He forced himself to concentrate on the familiar routine, the turns, the intersections, the distant flicker of streetlights in deserted neighborhoods. Yet every time his mind allowed a fraction of space to consider the passenger, a cold wave of fear washed over him. No whispers, no sound, only the oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from the back of the bus itself. He tried testing it, adjusting the bus's internal lights, tapping the rear window to see if any motion would respond, leaning slightly forward to catch a glimpse of the hooded figure's face. Nothing. The passenger remained motionless, unresponsive, and yet fully present. It was as if the figure occupied the space, but existed outside the laws of observation, a presence both tangible and untouchable. On the 5th night, Roger brought along his notebook, a small habit he'd kept for recording unusual events while on the late shift, from mechanical issues to odd passenger requests. He scribbled details of the route, the weather, the time, but the passenger's existence filled every line with uneasy frustration. He noted the time the figure boarded, the precise stop, the unchanging position at the back, and, crucially, the absence in the mirror. It was meticulous, almost obsessive, the way he sought proof for something that defied logic. The 6th night brought rain, a relentless drizzle that coated the streets with a slick sheen, reflecting the weak streetlights in fractured patterns along the asphalt. Visibility was low, and the wipers squealed against the windshield as Roger maneuvered the bus through the winding suburban streets. The passenger appeared as usual, standing beneath the dim lamplight, shoulders hunched slightly under a damp coat. The cold clung to them, seeping through the bus doors as they boarded, and the air carried a scent of wet earth and something faintly metallic that made Roger's throat tighten. He drove on, every stop an effort to ignore the growing weight in his chest. By the time he reached the back of the bus, the silence had become deafening. The absence of ordinary passenger noise, rustling bags, coughs, the creak of leather seats. So pronounced, it became a physical force pressing against him. And yet the figure remained seated, immobile, head bowed, hands folded neatly in their lap. For the first time, he saw it move. Or rather, he sensed it. A faint shift in the air, a subtle vibration beneath the bus floor. A damp chill that crept along the aisle toward him. Roger froze, gripping the steering wheel as his pulse spiked. He considered stopping entirely, letting the bus sit under the rain-blurred glow of the streetlights, but an inexplicable compulsion forced him to continue. There was a distance to the final stop that could not be avoided, a journey that demanded completion. When he finally pulled over, the bus doors opened, the hiss sounding unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent night. Roger watched, heart hammering, as he expected the passenger to rise and step off, as all other riders did. The figure remained seated. The minutes stretched, and the rain beat harder against the windows, pounding with a rhythm that seemed to echo inside his skull. Roger stepped out of the driver's seat, his boots clicking against the damp floor, and walked slowly toward the back. The seat was empty. The air smelled of wet asphalt and decay, faintly metallic, and yet the faint impression of a damp figure lingered where the passenger had sat. A droplet of water traced a line along the aisle floor, leaving a small wet footprint in the dim light. Roger's eyes widened, and his fingers trembled against the edge of the seat as he stared at it. The footprint had no match, no accompanying body, and yet it was as though someone had stepped lightly from the back row to vanish into nothing. The 7th night, Roger researched. He visited the public library before his shift, digging into old newspapers, microfilm records, and online archives, seeking a rational explanation. That was when he found it. A decades-old report about a commuter, a young man in his early 20s who had been struck by a passing car at that exact stop. The accident occurred late at night during a storm not unlike the one he had just driven through. Witnesses reported the boy had stepped off the curb to wait for a bus, just as his modern counterpart now did, and never made it home. The bus involved had left the area before emergency services could respond. Roger felt the weight of realization settle over him like a stone pressing down on his chest. The passenger he had seen every night, the one who had never appeared in the mirrors and had never disembarked, was tied to that tragic accident. The wet footprint, the damp chill, the impossible presence. They were the residue of a life abruptly ended, a soul somehow trapped within the very routine he now carried out each night. He returned to the bus that evening with a heaviness that pressed against his spine and lungs alike. The storm had begun once again, rain hammering the roof with almost violent insistence. The streets shimmered with reflections of broken light, distorted by the water pooling along the gutters. Roger adjusted his mirrors carefully before starting the engine, every instinct screaming that tonight would be different. When he arrived at the stop, the figure waited, as always, silent, unmoving, shrouded in wet darkness beneath the weak lamp. Roger approached the wheel and drove onward, past the other stops, along the familiar route that now felt impossibly long, haunted, as if each bend and corner were shadows stretching from some past wound he could not touch. The passenger did not speak, did not move, and still, when he checked the mirror, they were absent. Halfway through the route, the air in the bus shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, unnaturally, as if the storm outside had condensed into the enclosed space. Roger's breath fogged in the weak interior lights. A faint dripping sound began to echo along the aisle, rhythmically, impossibly deliberate. His eyes followed the sound, and there it was, a wet footprint forming slowly on the floor, appearing out of nowhere, as if the passenger's weight pressed upon the surface for just a moment before vanishing. No sound accompanied it beyond the subtle drip of water. No figure accompanied it beyond the impression in the dim light. Roger's throat tightened, but he could not look away. The footprint was small, juvenile, impossibly light, yet undeniably real. As the bus approached the final stretch of the route, his vision blurred with rain-streaked windows and the throbbing pulse of anxiety that had begun to dominate his every sense. He pressed on, steering with mechanical precision, while every nerve screamed that something beyond comprehension was at work. The passenger had never moved, had never acknowledged him, and yet the traces they left were as tangible as the metal of the bus itself. Each step toward the back, each drop of water marking the floor, each fleeting glimpse of motion in the peripheral, everything combined into a presence both terrifying and inescapable. Then, as the bus entered a long stretch lined with abandoned houses, the familiar figure appeared before him in the mirror for the first time, though only fleetingly. The pale face, eyes wide with hollow longing, turned slowly, tilting just enough to meet his own gaze in reflection. For a heartbeat, Roger felt a profound understanding settle over him. This was a soul trapped between worlds, endlessly repeating the final journey it could never complete, bound to the road, to the bench, to the last bus of every night. A sudden gust of wind rattled the bus's doors, and in that same instant, the figure vanished. The wet footprint remained, dark and glistening in the dim light. Roger stared at it, frozen, a visceral recognition gnawing at him. Some presences cannot be dismissed, cannot be ignored. They endure, persistent as memory, insistent as regret. The rain softened, the wind subsided, yet the imprint lingered, a reminder of what had been witnessed, a permanent scar upon the otherwise ordinary night. Roger parked the bus at the final stop, hands trembling as he turned off the engine. He remained seated for several minutes, eyes fixed on the aisle where the footprint marked the floor, unwilling or perhaps unable to step out. The city beyond the windows was quiet, almost serene, but nothing could soothe the echoing weight of the encounter. Every night, when the streets darkened and the lights flickered, the passenger might return, might appear once more at the familiar lamppost, waiting silently to board, leaving traces of a presence that could never fully touch the living. He knew now, with unsettling certainty, that the bus route, the lamp-lit bench, the wet footprint, they were all part of something beyond explanation. Every time he would drive the last bus of the night, he would do so under the shadow of the passenger who never disembarked, whose reflection never appeared, whose journey remained forever incomplete. And though he could not say why, he also knew he would never stop driving, never stop watching, because some presences demand to be acknowledged, and some journeys cannot be left unfinished. The bus sat in the empty depot as dawn crept slowly over the horizon. Roger stepped out at last, the imprint of the night lingering like cold steel against his back. In the fading darkness, he could almost feel the faint brush of unseen hands, the subtle pressure of a presence that had accompanied him through every mile, and he knew with certainty that, when night fell again, the passenger would be there, waiting, unmovable, inescapable, and utterly real in the way that only ghosts can ever be.